an overview of the work that we've been doing, developing the team around the locality cluster model. My name's Phil Hazlitt. I'm Head of Education Strategy and Development, and I've been sponsoring the kind of implementation of this. James Saunders is with us, who's going to take us through most of the detail around how TALC's been operating and the success so far. And we're going to hear from Ben as well, the head teacher at Lakeside, who has experienced use of the team around the locality to give the school perspective on how that's gone. In WebEx, you can there's a chat function, so I think probably during the session it might be better if you've got questions that come up to pop them in the chat if they as and when they come up. We will have an opportunity at the end if you want to, and you're brave and you want to unmute and ask a question in person, that's fine as well. But throughout the session, if you want to just use the chat function, that'd be great. I'm just going to do a little bit on strategic context. So we've been doing a number of these webinars, kind of highlighting and focusing on elements of the work that we're doing, the joint additional needs and high needs transformation work. And what I try to do in front of all of them is just put them back in the strategic context. Our focus at the moment in all of our work around the joint additional needs program is to try to make sure that we're focusing our funding and support earlier in the system. As part of that, we're talking about kind of 3 core foundations of getting our system right. So there's the funding element, making sure our funding is working and supporting earlier intervention. Also making sure the services and support that we offer are targeted at earlier intervention level. And TALC is a really good example of how we're trying to do that, to make sure we're really targeting and providing support at the right time. But the other key element, and the one that will I guess is a core element of the work we're doing with TALC, is around collaboration, and in this instance, good, effective multi-agency working, all the key stakeholders supporting children decision making for children and young people at the right time to enable them to access the support they need. It's the premise behind TALC. I won't say loads because I'll ruin what James is about to say, but really this is in the strategic picture, when we're talking about trying to make sure collaboration is working in the system, this is a key development for us, and one that we've been piloting now for most of COVID. Actually, it launched in September last year, so we've been trying to make sure this is operating. I'll hand over to James, who can talk a little bit more about the model. If you've got any questions around the strategic picture, etc., at the end, then I'm more than happy to pick those up. James.
Thanks, Phil. Great. If we can pop on to the next slide, that'd be helpful. So I just want to set a little bit of context before we get into any of the details. So if we go back to July of 2020, there was a multi-agency meeting convened to look at how we, as a group of agencies, how GCC internal teams, as well as partner agencies, might be able to support schools with a post-COVID response. At that point, we were talking about young people who would have been out of school potentially for up to 6 months, and how can we as agencies support some of those existing or emerging needs of those young people. So that's where TALC is rooted. TALC is a multi-agency approach, and it's centered around removing barriers to education for young people. It's about identifying and supporting those unmet needs for young people. And we initially started TALC with 2 pilots, one in Cheltenham and one in Gloucester. They had slightly different nuances, as well as a universal offer that we offered to all other schools across the county as part of the pilot phase. Those pilots have informed where we are today, and what the map you see on the screen in front of you is the dual locality model that we have moved into, based on the learning we took from the pilot phase. So the pilot phase ran from October last year through until the Easter holidays this year, and we have been operating this dual locality model since the Easter holiday period. And the premise of moving to the dual locality model was, well, one, around a local response to local needs. So young people's needs being responded to by local agencies and local professionals. One of the key themes that came out of the Universal pilot was that when we've got somebody sitting in one of the Cotswold teams discussing a young person who's based in the forest, it isn't necessarily best fit for that young person. Also, the dual locality model does align with most of partner agencies sitting around the TALC table, and I'll talk about those agencies in just a moment. And also, it has the added benefit of being able to support and facilitate relationships amongst the agencies who are attending and schools who are attending with those agencies who are represented. It's been really clear through the pilot and the predecessor, that was the team around the school, that one of the key benefits was those relationships that schools coming back to TALC would be able to build with agencies, but also that agencies could build with one another in response to those local needs. Thanks, Phil. Next slide, please. Okay, so on the visual in front of you, you see a number of agencies. I wanted to share with you those agencies who are involved both at a strategic level and at an operational level. So at a strategic level, we have a multi-agency steering group, representation from strategic thinkers within those agencies, so heads of service, service leads, coming together to provide some steer and some governance really for the type of work and the direction that the operational groups are taking. And then the operational groups are kind of the nitty gritty of the TALC, really. That's the bit when we talk about TALC, that's what people think about. It's a multi-agency forum. We meet virtually. There are 6 operational groups that take place, 3 for each dual locality and 1 for each school phase. So, for example, in Cheltenham and Tewkesbury, you'll find a primary operational group and a secondary operational group. And the partners on the visual in front of you are either engaged. I think there are 1 or 2 that we're still having conversations with about bringing on board with the operational groups. But as you can see, it's quite a robust multi-agency approach to thinking about how we remove those barriers for young people. Phil. Just wanted to talk through the target audience for TALC so that everybody is really clear. We're talking about young people whose needs act as a barrier to them accessing that full and appropriate education. Those young people will also be able to be supported in the early intervention arena, so through a non-statutory response. So for those young people that aren't open to social care teams, those young people that aren't in receipt or in the process of applying for an EHCP. And also, we will expect that those young people will have access previous early intervention. So we're saying that TALC isn't your first port of call for early intervention. It's the arena that's there to support for those young people where early intervention isn't quite working. And we've got some concerns that if things don't change for those young people, that things may escalate into the statutory arena. Worth pointing out that there is that 4th criteria there that around young people who suddenly find themselves at risk of exclusion due to their unmet needs. So we're not talking about those young people whose needs have been gradually escalating over a period of time. We'd hope to discuss those young people much earlier in the cycle. We're talking about those young people where we have an incident that takes place that leads that young person to school thinking they may need to explore exclusion for that young person. Okay, moving on. Thanks, Phil. Okay, just sharing with you now the visual, the flowchart that is in place to support schools with identifying which young people would be appropriate for a referral to the team and locality cluster. What I will say is please use this flowchart in conjunction with a conversation with either your early help coordinator or your outcome coordinator. They're really well placed to be able to support you to think about other early interventions that may not have been explored prior to TALC. What we want to do is ensure that when schools complete referrals, they are progressed through to the appropriate support. Now, if there there are earlier interventions that haven't been explored, it may be that we come back and signpost in the first instance. So that 5-10 minute conversation with your ECHO or OC is a really good use of time, because it avoids the need to complete a referral if there are other interventions that are available prior to thinking about that TALC referral. Ultimately, though, what you do is you place the young person in the top left-hand corner of the flowchart and work your way through. It's self-explanatory, really, but if anyone has any questions about the use of the flowchart, they, as I said, they can pick up that conversation with the outcome coordinator or the early help coordinator. Thanks, Phil. I will just say, actually, sorry, Phil, do you mind popping back? I will just add a couple of points on the referral process. So in terms of referrals are open at this time only to schools. Okay, so schools can make referrals when they have concerns. When a submitted referral reaches the TALC team, the first thing that happens now, informed by the pilots that we undertook, is that a triage will take place. And that's really just to make sure that we've got all of the relevant information that we need to be able to progress onto an operational group. What we don't want to do is get to the operational group and have lots of unanswered questions that we potentially could have provided some answers for before we get to that arena. It's about making best use of that multi-agency arena and the time that the professionals commit to those meetings. And there are regular dual locality meetings, as I said, for each school phase within each dual locality. And we can pop on now, Phil, if that's okay. Okay, so I'm just going to talk to this slide. Really, it's a case study of a young person who came through the TALC a few months ago. It was a year 3 male student. When he came to the team around locality cluster, he was already on a part-time timetable. He had a My Plan in place. School reported that he was academically able, but the concerns were his struggles with relationships with peers. He was verbally and often physically aggressive towards his peers, occasionally physically aggressive towards staff in school as well. There was a family support worker allocated, and the family support worker was predominantly working with mum in the home on the chaotic home environment and life that was in place at that point for the young people in the home. So this young person had 2 siblings, and all 3 of them had witnessed historic domestic abuse. So when we had this conversation at the operational group meeting, multi-agency group meeting, we had a conversation about alternative provision outreach, and one of the takeaways, one of the actions that the group felt was important, was that the alternative provision were able to provide initially an observation to understand the presenting behaviours of this young person. Obviously, alternative provision quite familiar and comfortable working with young people who are presenting in the way that I've described this young man was, and they then were going to offer a Thrive intervention, but they were going to offer that as outreach. They were going to offer that in the mainstream school, because the group felt really clear they didn't want to be taking this young person out of school. What the aim was to build time that he was spending in school. As I mentioned, he was on a part-time timetable. We wanted to keep him as part of that school community. The advisory teaching service were able to offer a whole school approach to offer some training and embed some strategies for teachers right across the school. It was a smallish school, it was a rural school, and so the ATS team went in and delivered a session and then some follow-up support around the whole school community, not just singling out this young person's presenting behaviours. The family support worker was encouraged to be able to work between home and school, to focus particularly on the morning transitions. We were hearing that when young person had a chaotic morning, he found it much more difficult to settle when he arrived at school. And also consideration for a male mentor was discussed. It was felt that an appropriate male role model for this young man, given the historic behaviours that he'd witnessed, would be helpful, would be healthy, and would be appropriate. So what we were looking to achieve for this young man was him being able to attend school more regularly, with the use of the male mentor working not just outside of school but also crossing over into school. We were able to build the time that this young man was spending in school during recreational times. School previously were asking that he was at home for this period, or that mum came to collect him, because of the risk that he posed in terms of his physical outbursts towards his peers. we were able to extend the timetable for this young man and the aim to work back to that full-time timetable. And some of that was due to the support that outreach that the alternative provision were able to provide. Some of that time where he wouldn't have been able to be in school, we were able to build in those outreach sessions. Mum was being supported to re-engage with the school. It was clear through conversations that the relationship had broken down between mum and school. So family support worker was able to offer that support, was able to support with the rebuilding of that relationship, and school report now that they have a much healthier, in their view, relationship with mum, and mum feels that she's more able to take concerns and have open conversations with school. And ultimately, school feel that they have an appropriate support network. School came to us feeling really isolated, feeling they'd done everything they could, everything that was in their power, their gift to be able to do. Now they feel like they've got a group of agencies that they can call upon and continue to call upon, not just for a very short period of time. They still have contact with one or two of those agencies now who are providing ongoing support and advice. So that's the kind of young person that we may typically discuss in one of the TALC meetings. So wanted to give you a bit of a flavour of what that looked like. We'll pop on now, Phil, thanks. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to introduce Ben Jordan from Lakeside Primary, who's on the call, to give you a bit of an overview from school's perspective. You've heard from me and what I think about TALC, but from a school perspective, I would imagine you would like to hear from another head teacher the views that they have. So Ben, if it's okay, I'm going to hand over to you now.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. Thank you, James. Morning, Phil. So for the next 10-15 minutes, what I'm going to do is kind of give you an overview of right from the beginning of my impressions of TALC up until current day, where we're still engaging with the process. So a little bit about Lakeside. So a large 3-form entry school, 568 pupils. We've got 126 pupils eligible for pupil premium, and 73 on My Plans and My Plan Pluses. So a really diverse school community. And like many of us on the call, I suspect we're facing probably more situations that require support than we ever have done before. My initial impressions of the model, and James is going to smile when I probably say that, was one that was filled with skepticism. I'm a head who is quite impatient in terms of getting things done for pupils who are vulnerable or who need support. And at times, not all the time, but at times, it's felt that the system has been designed to slow that pace of getting support for the children who need it, as well as creating workload for people in schools to try and go from one agency to the next and feel like you're repeating the same information over and over again, and that causes an element of frustration for staff, but also could relate into gaps for pupils who are vulnerable. So when I was first advised, and initially Phil suggested to it that we consider TALC, I went into it feeling that it wasn't going to give me that immediate impact that the young people in my school should have. So there was an element of initial skepticism. Fortunately, that impression changed quite dramatically, in that there was almost an immediate engagement following a large amount of kind of background research and background work through triage. So it not only enabled my staff to take a back step and consider the needs of the individual pupils, perhaps more than they'd done before, because that was what was needed for the initial triage. So it was not only class teachers, it was SENCO, it was pastoral support lead, it was the pupil themselves. So we went through a really detailed process of what have we done to offer, what have we done to support the young person, what impact was that having, and what difference could TALC make to it. So the benefits of the initial referral was that it made everyone step back and consider in-depth needs at all levels for that young person. And what I found was when I was putting that referral through, it enabled me to talk with real clarity and confidence, because the voice of the adult, the voice of the young person was there. Went through triage, and triage as you'd expect, was a detailed and complex process, but one where if you had the information, you were able to use that and pass on that perspective very, very quickly. The most important impact for me, and certainly for the school, was it when the referrals went through to panel. If I draw back at the initial skepticism at the beginning, I'm sure we've all found that at times we're saying the same things to professionals individually. So the biggest difference, and probably the biggest benefit that I've seen, is having heads of service on one call, and haven't experienced talc in real life, but experienced it virtually like this. So having a very clear strategy in terms of meeting, having input that's controlled but via professionals that have had that overview already. So rather than building a picture of the individual, they're able to present different lines of thought, different perspectives, different avenues to expertise that if you'd done it individually would have taken months and months to put in process. So having the head of service from housing, for example, not only has benefited the young person, but benefited their family. Having senior educational psychologists on the call that have gone through in detail the needs of the young person and been able to offer perspectives or signpost pieces of work or individuals have made a big difference. So I think that the benefits of it are having everyone around the virtual table. Everyone is able to offer opinions, but also to challenge those opinions. So, and I've been through 2 successful talc referrals for 2 pupils, one in Key Stage, both in Key Stage 1, that both of them would have met the vast majority of the criteria that James went through in the previous slide. And the benefit of having that engagement has enabled a better quality of provision to be given to both of those pupils, and to limit those kind of barriers to their learning, to their lived experiences of the home, and to risk of fixed term exclusion. Importantly, we've also been able to follow up those links, because you've then got the names of the heads of service who can support further. So rather than seeing the panel as a kind of first and last point for support, it's very much been viewed as the starting point for it. So we've engaged with other agencies who have been present on that, and the email has started, thank you for your support following the recent talc panel. You made this suggestion, we've done this, can you help further? And it has made a massive difference to the experiences of the 2 pupils in my school. So I think having that engagement, starting from that slightly skeptical starting point, has not only given me more confidence about the system, but it's also given my staff confidence. So on both panels, we've had my SENCO present. We've also had members of staff who have supported the young person present as well. So in terms of developmental opportunities for them, it is quite a pressurized arena in terms of you have to know the ins and outs of the young person, but I think we should all have that knowledge base anyway. But it's also empowered them to say, okay, I've seen the system working differently, and that's given more confidence. It's given more knowledge, but also it's made, and the critical thing I keep repeating myself is, it's made a big difference to the needs of the young people, and that's the most important thing. I think the message that I would give to other schools who haven't been part of the process is to make sure the initial evidence trawl prior to any referral going through is to make sure you've covered all of those bases. And James covered the flowchart. The flowchart was really helpful. And I think one of the other questions that came up in the chat was, where do I access the information? So we initially went through the talc links to the talc section of the website. There's some really good information there. There's clarity about the flowchart. There's clarity about what will happen if you're not successful with the referral. So message number one is make sure you've got all of the details about the young person and that you've sought the views of everyone working with them. And in the two that we did, that was all stakeholders. That was myself, my SENCO, the pupil themselves, any external agencies that were working with them, parents. So it's turned into a really valuable piece of work. Be clear about what kind of support that you need. And don't go in with an overly ambitious wish list. And the heads and all heads of service on the call, and Phil may smile at this, you always go in with an overly ambitious wish list, but be specific in terms of what the impact of what you're asking for will have on that young person. Not only immediate impact, but medium and long term, because there will always be follow-ups to that. So make sure you know the person well and make sure you're clear in terms of what that roadmap is going to look like for that support. Make sure that you take the names of the people on the TALC panel, because that's been hugely valuable for us. And be prepared to be honest. So for one of our TALC referrals, we've gone back in. We've had a 12 weekly review, James, just looking for a nod. Yeah, so a 12 weekly review where the progress and impact of the actions that you've agreed have been reviewed and you're held to account for those. But then one of them has gone back to panel because the progress that has been made wasn't as much as everyone thought. So we've gone back through panel again and given a range of new pieces of work for everyone to do to try and improve those outcomes. So I would, the clear message is for me, with a big school with a lot of need, is that it's been work that has been worthwhile because it's benefited two young people who are very, very vulnerable. They continue to be vulnerable, but they've benefited massively from the support that they've received. And that it's a process that I will definitely use again, purely for all the reasons that I've said. So I've gone from slightly doubting a process that I thought might be based on jumping through hoops or a series of endless pieces of paper that then don't go anywhere, to something that is significantly more joined up. And James mentioned collaboration. The critical bit for us is we've been able to collaborate with key individuals, whether that's early help, whether that's social care, whether that's a range of educational professionals, EPs, etc., and it's made a big difference. So from my point of view is know what you need or what you want to achieve, be clear in the evidence gathering before you submit the referral, and then be prepared to be held to account. But the more you know the child, the easier that's going to be. So from my point of view, and I'm not here to sell the system, and James hasn't asked me to do that, but the journey that we've been on at Lakeside with TALC has gone from something that we thought was going to be quite demanding in terms of effort, but not as successful in terms of impact. The demand and effort we put into it, we are now seeing the impact for those two people. James, I'm quite happy to have any questions now or hold on and wait.
You're on mute, James.
Fantastic, thanks. So if we're all right, I'll just wrap up with the last slide, and then we'll open up for questions for any questions that people might have for me or for Ben. So Janet, thank you. You've already shared in the chat the link that's on the on this slide. So there's a bit of talk there around how do we kind of access the flowchart, also the referral form, as well as lots of other documents. They're all on the GLOS Families website. So the TALC landing page, which Janet's helpfully put in the chat for us and is on the screen here. But if you Google GLOS Families and in the keyword search you select TALC, you will get through to the TALC landing page quite easily that way as well. So just the key messages that I'd like you to take away, or what I will say just before we move on, obviously Ben's given his perspective and Ben is ahead at a primary school. On the website, you will also find a short video that we've recently recorded with a secondary leader. So if you're here from a secondary school today or listening back from a secondary school and you'd like to understand the perspective from a secondary senior leader, then do go and have a look on the TALC landing webpage. So the key messages that I need to take away for today is that TALC is absolutely about early help and early intervention. It should be used when previous early help hasn't improved outcomes for young people or hasn't wholly improved outcomes for young people. And it is there to support, the multi-agency approach is there to support the escalation to statutory services to prevent that. We'll support it if that's appropriate. If we've got needs of a young person and they need to be met within the statutory arena, we're of course going to offer that advice and that support. However, the multi-agency group there is to support in that early intervention arena, is to support us to be able to manage those needs within the community. Also, just to be really clear that the focus is about the multi-agency information sharing and as Ben said, I'll say it again, collaboration. It's about removing barriers for that young person that prevent them from accessing their full and appropriate education. And I want to be really clear, it's not about funding. So Ben was clear about, be clear what you're coming for. Be clear that you're coming for a conversation with a vast number of multi-agency partners who can remove some barriers and can offer some support around interventions for young people. Please don't come to us because you think this is a pot of cash to support this young person. It's not about the funding, it's about the access to the multi-agency forum. So please do go and have a look at the website. The link's there, the link's in the chat. We'll send this out afterwards with the link as well. I guess now there's 10 minutes left. If anybody has any questions, take yourself off mute or yeah, if you're not able to, pop something in the chat.
I can't see any hands being raised or microphones opening. I'll just give it a second for questions to appear in the chat box. Whilst we're doing that, can I just say thank you to James and thank you to Ben for giving some overview today. It's really really helpful and really great to hear it from the school side as well. For me, this is really important. I think James touched on the fact this isn't about funding. It's a really good point to make, and probably one I should have made at the start, that whilst TALC can provide a route to access some support financially, that's not the premise of this. The premise of it was always about good multi-agency working for those that are at risk and struggling to access education. So we've got a question that's just come in there. So parent carer needs to be fully on board, not done to. Parents will trust professionals, but once they feel they're not involved.
Phil, can I try and answer that one?
Yeah, of course you can, Ben.
Without breaking confidence, I think that and that comment about parental trust is a really important one, because I think what can be quite daunting with a TALC panel, if it's daunting for a member of staff, it's probably triply daunting for a parent, particularly a parent who may have vulnerabilities. So I think that the critical piece there is making sure that a conversation takes place with the parent so that they're fully on board, so they're aware of what TALC is and what TALC isn't, but that the premise is driven by improving outcomes for their child or children. And certainly in the two that we've done, that initial conversation and information sharing and that openness with the parents saw it as being an extension to what we were trying to do to help, rather than the school providing an additional barrier. And that's not to say that some of the conversations during that panel weren't challenging or probing, because they had to be, but we found that parents were very, very much on board as a result of the conversations we've had with them prior. And again, it's this sensible information sharing, but putting their children first, and that made a big difference.
And I'll thanks Ben. I'll just add to that in that young people are discussed at the TALC based purely on the consent of parents. So within we've got a really robust terms of reference, and within that there's a section on information sharing. There's also a document available within the terms of reference as one of the appendices that is a letter for parents that it really transparently tells them what the TALC process is about. It tells them who's involved, it tells them what kind of information will be shared, and it tells them what they can expect afterwards. After a TALC operational group meeting, the first step with every young person, with every family, is that we ask for a team around the family meeting to be formed, so that the agencies that have been pulled together through the TALC are able to go back and engage fully with the young person and with the wider family. So they will have explicitly consented and had input prior to the operational group meeting, and straight after that meeting, where we kind of formulate ideas and think about an action plan, we go back to the young person and go back to the family and share with them what the thinking has been so that they're on board with that. And of course, yeah, based on consent, working with the agencies based on consent, there's no obligation for them to engage with anything that we've offered, but the offer is on the table and we want to work with them to move things forward for that young person and for the wider family.
Thanks, guys. I don't think there's any more questions coming in. I guess for me, I just finishing off what I was saying before that question came in. I think I will say this is really important. There's a steering group that continues to oversee this work. We launched it in September, as James described, following during a period of quite a lot of pressure, and actually it was launched at pace because we were very conscious of the impact of COVID and the number of young people that might be in need of this kind of support because of COVID and that period of time out of school. And we obviously know what's happened since then. They've been out even longer. Our focus on that steering group now is sustainability. So how do we make sure this is a sustained model moving forward, and one that becomes part of out of a pilot phase really into a kind of business as usual operation, and that can be sustained. I keep coming back to sustained because from what I can see and my experience of this so far, good multi-agency working isn't a new phenomenon, right? I mean, this has been around for a long period of time. There's been lots of discussions about this in authorities across the country for many years. What you can see is that actually it's been the struggle with this kind of model is sustaining it once it's in place. So we're really focused on that, making sure we've got commitment from all agencies and all those involved to maintain the approach. Virtual, actually, funnily enough, does help with that because we're not having people travelling all around the county to attend meetings and the time that takes. So there's a benefit in the virtual. And I think just the other bit for me is that kind of case around the benefits of this, not just for the children and young people, but for the capacity issues that agencies talk about. If there are agencies on this call that are engaged, I think what we're seeing in the case we're making around this at this stage is that investment in support at the earlier stage will prevent that escalation and will reduce the capacity pressures further down the system, and that's a real focus for us moving forward. We are trying to make sure this is not a tick box exercise and something where schools are feeling like they have to jump through, and I think somebody mentioned jumping through hoops. It's not about jumping through hoops, and if it ever feels like that, then that's feedback we really want to have. And if you feel like you're doing something just for the sake of doing it, and a form's asking you to fill something in or provide something, or there's any kind of tick box element to it, then that is something I'm very desperate for us to avoid, because I know that we can fall into that trap at times. That's triggered something for Ben, who now wants to comment, I think.
Yeah, sorry, Phil. It's just echoing. So the one thing that's also been impressive is James in person, but also the team have also been receptive to feedback. So that idea, if there is a feeling that things aren't working or things could be tweaked, James has always been receptive to that, which reinforces the impression that the people running the service are listening and prepared to kind of say, yeah, it didn't go as well as we thought, but we're going to do this, this, and this, and that's been hugely beneficial for us.
Thanks, Ben. That's really helpful. I think that idea of continuous improvement, there's no perfect solution that rolls off in the first instance. There's always going to be development needed, and any feedback as you access and use the system would be much appreciated. I think, unless there's any other questions, I'll just finally thank James and Ben again, and thank you to you all for taking the time out to come and listen. If you've got any questions outside of the meeting or anything to follow up, we will circulate the slides and the links, but also the access to the email address for TALC, which is talc@gloucestershire.gov.uk. Do get in touch. Otherwise, I will thank you and wish you all a very good day and week. Thanks very much for your time.